Chooch. Nottage, Johnny, Tachik. Ahousaht. It's a pleasure to see you all face to face. And I think about this phrase and how ancestrally that, when we think about it today, it might seem redundant because we often see each other so often face to face. But I think this pandemic has really brought that to light again, of just how important and how precious it is to be able to meet together and see each other face to face. And I share in the sentiments that Les was sharing earlier this morning of how great it is to see many of our people together, to hear the laughter, to be able to engage in these conversations, and just to be in a room full of this level of power and spirit is much needed for all of us. For me, I feel it personally, that it's been too long over the past couple of years and being away from each other. And to be able to spend these types of quality time together and focus on such important things like our health and our well-being, and looking forward toward the future for our young people, for our children, for those yet to come. I'm filled with joy this morning because we raced down to Victoria yesterday. Our first grandchild was born. And so we're entering into a whole different stage of life. And to welcome in that type of life is just so uplifting. It lifts my spirit to see that you are all here. And I'm happy to be here with all of you. I'm honored to be invited to share today. Health and wellness, even diabetes specifically, has been such a devastating factor in our family's life. We've lost loved ones to this disease, to these challenges. And one of the hardest parts looking back at those losses was that much of it was preventable. And when we look at where things were at, and we could trace these pieces back, and the changes in our diet, the changes in our lifestyle, the changes in who we are as Ka's people, that these things have contributed towards a lot of hardship for us today. And so it seems like all of the challenges that we face as Ka's people, that it always sort of circles back to the same situation. To me, it really represents the disconnect, the challenges that we have as a people from being removed from our lands, from our way of life, from our spirituality, from our language, from our foods, from our medicines, from our families. All of these things, wave after wave after wave, just destructing our way of life, dismantling our houses and our families, completely altering and transforming who we are as a people into the people that we are today. And still we hear and we see and we feel that strong aasʔałuk, that spirit of our people. Like the activity this morning of calling our ancestors in. What a much needed piece for the aasʔałuk to have the ancestors here with us and to acknowledge that. So I just want to start with thanking and acknowledging Rachel and the team that pulled this together, and for the invitation to share. I really come here with more open ears than I think more to say, because I really respect and I really appreciate the stories that each of you bring, the experience, the knowledge, the wisdom, the intelligence that collectively we have as a people. Nuu-chah-nulth Finland, My name is aasʔałuk. It means takes care of the day. It's a name from my Celtsmith roots, from the Marshall family. I come from Ahousaht, from Celtsmith, from aasʔałuk lineage, through the Seacher, Marshall, and Louis families. Charlotte Rampanen. My mother is Charlotte Rampanen, formerly Seacher. And she's been the biggest inspiration in my life, growing up and just leading that path forward and helping me to be able to understand the challenges of living in this world, but carrying forward the teachings of our ancestors and those important values and principles that make up who we are. John Rampanen. My late father was John Rampanen Sr., and he was a man who emigrated from Finland and also found himself displaced here in this country that we call Canada. He was rejected at the time when he came in the 50s because he sounded differently. He spoke a different language. He had a different name. His name was Kalavi, and he changed his name to John because it was more popular in that time. And that's how I got my name. And this is a man who not only came from the other side of the world, but found a home here in Nuu-chah-nulth territory, and found a partner, a wife, my mother, and started our family. And eventually brought us back to the place that we call Seacher Bay. And so for the last 18 years, my family, my wife, Tlutsmaks Wakitusis, Nuu-chah, Natanis Dejerle, Unaknish Aklakwak, Tatnais. We have 8 children. And we're also raising 3 of our nephews. So we have 11 children. And for 18 years, on and off, we've been living on our territory in Seacher Bay. Since the pandemic started, it was sort of a blessing in disguise, and it's sometimes challenging to say that because there was so much loss that we've experienced, so much disconnect and so much distance that has been created through this pandemic. And I know that when it started, it really made me think and made our family think, because we got pushed back out onto the land. We were living here in Aasʔałuk, and we were here because we really wanted to invest in the language and get immersed in our language, and that became the priority. And it was really challenging for years, almost 20 years now, off and on. I remember sitting with the late Carolyn Little, Linda Watts, many others who have since passed, who were just such amazing knowledge holders and teachers, language speakers. And just to be with them was so inspiring. And then the urgency that was felt as we were losing these loved ones that we were just connecting with really kind of propelled us to put more effort forward as a family with language. And through the time it was really challenging because we'd have to not take on work and be unemployed and struggle and be stressed with bills and all the things that we all get stressed with from time to time in this world that we live in now, in order to prioritize language. And we would go back out to Seacher Bay, the children and us, we would harvest food. Yaisi, kluchun, and different things that were just available right away that we were familiar with. As we gradually would bring these back here to Aasʔałuk, where we would connect with elders. See, my grandparents, not Naneksu, Ian, Margaret Seacher. My late grandparents are Ian and Margaret Seacher. And unfortunately, I lost my grandparents at an early age and wandered, I feel, for quite some time until I became a father. It wasn't until I was in my 20s and my first child was born, Kaylila, who will be performing this evening for us. Ahousaht, she goes by in Koas. When she was born, it changed my life. And it made me start to realize and appreciate the things that I don't know. And a lot of what I did not know, admittedly, was who I am as a Koas person. And it prompted me to come back home. We moved back here to Aasʔałuk from the mainland, and eventually that led us back out to Ahousaht, to our territory. And so that challenge, the challenge that was taken on by becoming a father and becoming a husband, were the first steps back to becoming a Koas person in a fuller way. I'd spent a long time in my life. There was potlatches, there was other things that Mom would bring us to. But I didn't have the understanding. I was a little kid, probably one of the noisy ones that was told to be quiet and without explanation, and left in the bleachers at the old athletic hall or other places to quietly observe from that spot, trying to decipher and determine what was happening on the floor through this young set of eyes and that young mind. And I appreciate that, though. I appreciate that opportunity was there. I just, in hindsight, wish that there was a bit more for the young people at the time to have a deeper understanding of not only why it was important to be quiet, but what was being said. And it took me a long time to realize that piece, the importance of what was being said in our language, and how powerful and how valuable and how important those teachings are. The sayings of our ancient ones. And the teachings of our elders and our ancestors. These are things that I was deprived of, and many of us have been through different processes, what we could, in a larger, broader way, call colonization. I think of it as like a wave. Like we have stories that go way back in our history. We have stories of survival. Teach sui mitnish, klimutumak. We survived this extended time of darkness that occurred long time ago when the world went dark for many, many days, if not weeks or months. Klimutumak, or teach sui mitnish, takek, ochish, mushik. We survived earthquakes and tidal waves. Our people have been very resilient and we've taken on many different challenges. And when we start to look back at those stories and that history and the teachings and the legacy, the resilience that's been built by our people that has pushed forward, that is the power and the strength that we draw from. So when we're taking on these challenges, if it's diabetes like we're acknowledging today and labeling it for what it is, putting it out into the center, and identifying it together of what it truly is and how it impacts each of us on a personal level, on a family level, on a community level. That is the same way as our ancestors. The way that we used to be. The changes that happened to us when the Mamachni arrived and our whole world was changed. The world became very different. Now the way that we are today, this is a whole different reality that we're living in. And so when we started to become immersed in language and culture and history and the teachings, and our children were very little and starting to grow, we would share the stories with them. We would go out to Seacher Bay and harvest the foods that we were aware of at first. And admittedly, there was some hard times and challenges of being out there. I recall one time with my brother-in-law, we were at White Pine, and early on I was just learning about harvesting shellfish off the beach, and I wasn't fully familiar with how quick the tide moves. And we were looking all around the beach for clams. My brother comes from northern Alberta, my wife comes from Fort McMurray First Nation, and they were raised in Prince Rupert area by their father, Victor, the late Victor Reese. So he was displaced himself. He came from Vancouver and had spent most of his life in Vancouver, so he didn't know about clams or mussels or other things on our beaches either. And we went and we started to harvest, and we weren't having any luck where we were digging on the beach, and we found a spot near the creek where we started to find clams, and we started to fill our buckets, and we were excited and watching the bucket fill up. And after the buckets finally got full, we turned to go bring it to the boat, and the boat was drifting way out in the bay. Oh no, this was, I think, early March, so it was pretty cold. Oh, I had to swim out to the boat, and I don't know if anybody's ever had to climb into a boat from the water, but it's not designed to be made easy to do that. And so that was a hard-learned lesson, something that I'll never ever do again. I've never ever go onto a beach anymore without having an anchor or a line attached to a rock or something, or maybe even to my foot, so that I'm not going to lose track of that boat. So I share that story because when we went out, I didn't know what I was doing. I had young children and my wife, and she was pregnant, and we knew it was important to go out to the land. We knew it was important to connect with that piece of who we are, that was a huge disconnect. And so we did it, and we brought our children, and they learned alongside us, and it was like we were all babies. We were all Nuu-chah-nulth. We were all just learning these pieces, and it was I remember it being such a jubilant and joyous type of celebratory experience with so much excitement. How kids are when they're learning things for the first time and they're taking an interest in it, and how passionate they can be about those things. Well, we started to feel and develop that as a family as we started to take more and more steps back out onto the land. And so we would harvest these foods and bring them back to aasʔałuk here and sit with elders and adopted grandparents as a result of that. And it wasn't about just picking their brains for information or how do you say this and how do you say that, or although those were part of the conversation from time to time, what it turned out to be was just building a relationship, rebuilding and repairing a relationship with our elders that I didn't have in my life, but I wanted to ensure that the children have in theirs, that they would have grandparents that they could go to and talk to, that they could hear stories, they could hear the language, they could have these things that as an adult, as a father, that I wasn't yet able to provide to them. And so that was the importance. We would come back and we would share what little bounty we got at first, the little bits of clams and oysters or mussels and maybe some rock cod or other things, tushkor, was a favorite one I remember of tattoo. She would always ask for that. And so, we'd bring these as gifts, as payment, because we didn't have money. We didn't have any funding. We didn't have anything else to give, but it turned out that that was probably the best thing that we could pay with, was the foods from our land and the medicines that we were learning about. We would sit in these elders' houses here in town, and they would generously start to share their stories of when they were young and the experiences that they had. I remember the late Alan Dick, Tim talking about when he was a little boy and how his uncles and his grandfather came and gifted him one day with the little tiny chuppets, his very first chuppets. And he was instructed to go out and harvest clams, and he filled it up with clams and he brought it back, and that was his payment. And that was the inspiration, that we don't have to find that funding all the time. And that was the part that clicked for us, is that we can do this in a different way. And I think from that point forward, doing it in a different way, doing it in our way, became more deeply entrenched in our family way of doing things, which really enabled us and prompted us to go back out onto the land. And so those conversations became more and more rich, deeper and deeper, as that relationship began to establish more and more with the elders. And they would share teachings of different foods and medicines, things that we hadn't eaten or tasted or smelt in a long time. I remember the seal, the hair seal, and how elders would talk about how they hadn't had it since they were a little kid, and that it was so common that on a long trip or something that it would be the blubber or the dried meat that they would be chewing on as they go for a long trip. And then we'd go and we harvested our first our first seal, and brought it back, and the joy that it brought to the old ones who hadn't had that taste sensation in such a long time. We would bring these things to Ahousaht school too, where we were closely connected, where we brought our children because we wanted them here in town to be involved in culture in whatever way that meant. And Ahousaht school has been one of those shining lights, in that regard, and the quality of care and love and nurturing that they provide our children in our own way was something that we deeply valued. And so we would bring seals and bears and wolves and other things as we gradually started to harvest and process other foods from our land. And we were learning too as we were going along, but in our learning we would share with the children, and we would provide that opportunity for them to learn alongside with us. And it was such an exciting experience. It was something that I don't think those children will ever forget also. The elders that came into those spaces were reminded and triggered. We hear that term and we use that term so often with negative connotation, which is rightfully so, because we have so many negative triggers around us as class people. And yet there are positive triggers, and I remember seeing it and feeling it. When the children sing and dance, there's that's part of the solution or the remedy towards the trauma that we feel as a people. When we taste the foods for the first time again, and we remind our palates, our traditional palate of those foods, it's feeding our spirit as well as our body. And so, there's so many different layers to the importance and significance that our food has to offer. And that's an area that my wife and I have become deeply involved in for 20 years or so now. And, since we became parents in that way and moved back here to Nuu-chah-nulth territory. And so, the medicines of our ancestors, the practices that we have, all of the ways that our ancestors formed a way of life that was interconnected with this environment. We often hear the term aasʔałuk or aasʔałuk. We are all one and interconnected, or aasʔałuk, that we all come from one source or one root. One of my greatest mentors, who's now passed, was my Uncle Simon Lucas. I spent a lot of time with him over the last few years of his life, and I cherished every moment that we had together. We all, I think, know of this man, and he impacted our lives in different ways. And my Auntie Julia, such a strong powerhouse, and that couple was so inspirational to be able to see, to feel that how dynamic it can be when we embrace one another's diversity and our uniqueness as couples. And so my wife and I, we learned from that experience, and we nurture one another's uniqueness and diversity, and we celebrate the common things that we have. Although she comes from far away, my wife, she has found a home and she's set roots in the territory here. And I really appreciate that. And I see that the learning that we've had from our elders and watching and observing without them perhaps even saying, just being and having the opportunity to be with each other in that way, to learn in that way. I think that's what's really needed for our people. So we take on these challenges like diabetes, and I know that many people in this room have stories to share, either personal or family related. We've all been impacted by these types of things. We could very easily change that title, change that label to another challenge that's in our community, because we have, unfortunately, so many of them. Over the last few generations, it's been like a series of waves that just keep coming over and over and washing over our lands each time. Nuu-chah-nulth, that concept of the flood. And when the flood comes up and the waters recede and the land is transformed, we often find ourselves confused, trying to pick up the pieces, trying to figure out where we're at, where we're going to go, and all those things. And we haven't not been here before. We have been here many times. And I find hopefulness in that fact. When we were forced to go back out onto the land, it seems funny to call it being forced, but the pandemic did that. There was no way that we could stay in town here with the size of family that we have. Our children would go crazy, locked up in the house in town here, and we knew that. So we immediately went out to Citrus Bay. And it was, something that we were gradually becoming more and more accustomed to being in town here again. The conveniences, or so-called conveniences, of being in town. I'm reminded of a speech that was given, again, maybe I'll share the background of the story. It's related to late Uncle Simon. He was in the hospital and he had suffered a minor stroke, and he was recovering in the hospital. This was at a time when we were spending each day with each other, and I was literally picking his brain as much as I could, and he was okay with it. And so I would walk over to the hospital, he'd tell me about different medicines, plant medicines, and then I would go do my best to walk through the forest behind the hospital, find it. One of them was aasʔałuk, the horsetail. Aasʔałuk is a good medicine, and he was really fond of it. And I'd pick some of it fresh around this time of year, and would go over to the hospital and would just soak it in cold water, and he'd sip on it through the day and share. He'd share knowledge, language, whatever came to his mind. And we'd sit there and have these really engaging and interesting conversations, and Auntie Julia too, right at the bedside. And one day we were talking about our roots, we were talking about where we come from, Auntie and I, talking about family lineage and history, talking about Ahousaht. And there was a fellow who was in the bed next to us. There was just a curtain that was dividing the two beds between this man, this elderly Mamachli man, and Uncle Simon's bed. And it piqued his interest. He heard Ahousaht in our dialogue, and he opened up the curtain a little bit, and he asked if he could open it, and he asked if that's where we were from. And we told him yeah, and so he got really excited, and he told us about his grandfather. And his grandfather's name was John Ross. And John Ross was one of the first missionaries, and he built some of the first schools in our territory, in Ahousaht and in Barkley Sound, in Ahousaht and Toklat territory. And he was Ahousaht also. And so this man had a big impact when he came through our territories, and this was in the early 1900s, around 1900 to 1915 or so, in that time frame. And so that was interesting enough, and this fellow's name was Dan Ross, a descendant of John Ross, that first missionary that came through. He wasn't the first, but he definitely helped build the first schools. But the interesting add-on to that was that this man, John Ross, kept memoirs. He kept a diary, a journal of his experience amongst our people. And Dan Ross had a copy of it, and he shared it with us. So over the next week or so, we poured over it. It's about 80 pages or so of memoirs from that time frame from this man. And it was so interesting to read that other perspective. I mean, growing up at school, we always hear that side, that story of history, the colonial side or the Mamachli side of history. But in this case, it was more personal. It was a more direct account of an era, a time frame that we don't often hear much of, at least I didn't, of around the early 1900s. And one little piece in that memoir really jumped out at us, and it was McQuinn's grandfather, who went by the name of Chief Billy at the time, a really prominent and respected leader in that day and age. And this was a time when Christianity was starting to make its way in. And one of the differences that was happening in our territories is both parents often were working and busy throughout the year. The sealing schooners and other ships would harbor outside of our villages, and many of the men from our villages would board the schooners because we were prized employees. We were paid equal pay also to Nuu-chah-nulth people, which wasn't very common in those times. But they understood that we were experts with the expertise that we had of harvesting on the ocean. And these ships would come and intentionally pick up as many of the men from our communities as they could, knowing that they would get some of the hardest and best workers out on the water, out on the ocean. So for long periods of time, many of the men from our communities would go off way up into Alaska, way down towards Oregon and California, just like our ancestors did previous, but in a different capacity. And while this happened, a lot of the women were engaged with work as well, following the berry patches through the season. I know my late great-grandmother, Susan, was always traveling in her day up and down the coast. She came from Statley and Lillooet territory, and she would go to family connections all the way to Montana and other places and follow the berry patches and harvest. And that was common in that day, that both parents would be off working. So it was actually convenient at first, and you could read this in the memoirs of this man, John Ross, that many of our people were sending the children to their schools, and it was voluntary. And it was convenient because there was an understanding that the world was changing around us. The world is changing, our world is changing. Chief Billy recognized this, and in 1910 he gathered all of the people of Ahousaht together at Mokdassis in his house. And he held an assembly because he knew there were people who were attempting to convert many of our people over to Christianity. So it concerned him, but he wanted to have an open conversation about it with the mustrim, with all of the people. And so he gathered all of the people, and there was well over 150 at the time, and they all went into his house, all of the adults, and engaged in this conversation. And some of those that were closely connected to the church, who were advocating for being converted into Christianity, had an opportunity to speak and to share and to explain why they felt it was important. And after they were listened to and they felt satisfied that they were given that opportunity, Chief Billy addressed the audience, the crowd, and the speech that he delivered, John Ross notes in his memoirs, and he says that because he couldn't understand the language, it didn't take away from the impact that the speech had. That even though he didn't know exactly what was being said, and that he found out through translation afterwards, he could tell that the magnitude, the importance of that speech that was delivered in that house and that day was something that was notable and was historical. And so he did his best to synthesize or to summarize what was said, and what Chief Billy shared with the people was that there's many great values that this other way of life has to offer, and these conveniences, and that's where I go back to, I used that word convenience, and it triggered this whole thought process. But these conveniences, and he called them 101 conveniences of this Nuu-chah-nulth way of life that we're becoming used to, we have to be cautious. We have to be careful about entering too quickly or too much into that way of life. Because what he recognized was that those who call themselves Christians, that they don't always uphold themselves in the way that they expect us to uphold ourselves. And so that he noticed that there was this disparity, that something was off. And when he started to understand and hear more about what Christian values and the beliefs and what the good things that were there within the Bible and the teachings that they have, he recognized that those are similar to our teachings too. And I hear Dave say this also, many different names for the Creator, but the common link is that the cleanliness that we have as a people was not understood by Nuu-chah-nulth. We were considered to be dirty, we were considered to be savage, we were considered to be less than. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And Chief Billy in that time, he saw this divergence of these cultures and this collision that was happening at this time. In the memoirs, you also learn that just prior to this speech, that unfortunately he had lost a young son that was called Billy, little Billy in the memoirs, who apparently, according to the Indian agent who came to investigate at the time, whose name was A.W. Neal, he came and determined that little Billy had died from eating too many pears, which seems absurd, but that was what they concluded. And Chief Billy was off in Victoria at the time of the passing, and he came home, and obviously he was very upset, very concerned with the treatment and the care that was being provided or not being provided by the school at the time. And immediately a lot of our people started to pull the children out of the school because it was voluntary. And so the church was very concerned because now suddenly they were losing all of these people, and it was exploding on them. So they called in the Indian agent to hold a court or a trial then and there in Ahousaht. And unfortunately, A.W. Neal, rather than being compassionate towards the chief who had just lost a son, instead turned and claimed that the pears were what caused the death and that the church was at no fault, and that Chief Billy needed to immediately stop instigating the hostilities of our people, and if he chose not to stop to instigate those hostilities, that they would have no choice but to arrest him and bring him to prison in Nanaimo and perhaps bring a gunboat in. And so that heavy-handed approach to such a sensitive issue that had just happened, the loss of a child, imagine, we've gone through so many losses as a people, especially in that particular time frame. But for it to be received in that way by the Mamatni authorities of the time, this man Neil, who felt inclined to hold that authority over our people and use fear tactics to try to quell or quiet our people, it was really indicative of where things were at. And this didn't discourage Chief Billy, though. In fact, that speech that I shared a little piece of, he shared that a few years after that occurrence, that experience had happened of losing his son to the school. At the same time, these churches, these schools, and these officials were writing communications back and forth to Ottawa, to Victoria, trying to figure out how they could deal with this issue, because many, many people, the word was spreading that these schools were not to be trusted and that people were turning on the Christian faith. And so this was a huge concern to the church, and they lobbied and lobbied to the federal government, and shortly thereafter, 2 years after, by 1912, it became mandatory. There was no longer a choice, and that's where the residential school system being forced into it really started to take full effect with our people. It's a really important chapter of our history, and to know that we had a leader who was speaking and standing up against it despite the hardships that he was experiencing directly in his own life, knowing that he was being silenced and that he was being threatened to go to jail or to be fined or to be removed from the community, all of those different things, and yet he still made that stand and he still shared his voice. It's empowering, it's uplifting still, and to take something from something so dark and so devastating. I think that that's one of the unique qualities of our people. It's very admirable, and we have a lot of pride as a Koas people, as Nuu-chah-nulth people, when it comes to whaling, to the successes that we may have had in past wars or those types of things. But to see that compassion, to hear it and to see where it unfolded and what it developed into, I think that that's one of the true gifts that our ancestors have shared with us. That compassion for one another, that interconnectedness with one another, and how when we come together like this, that there's great things that can happen from having these kinds of conversations. So learning more about that piece and that part of history, it looks like I might bring us up to 10:30. Learning about that chapter of history opened my eyes in a different way. So the importance of going back out onto the land. Here I was back in Port Alberni feeling stuck almost, but feeling grateful because of the people that I was able to sit with day after day. But it opened my eyes to the importance of revitalizing our daily practices of being on the land, of caring for one another, caring for ourselves, repairing that relationship. Because I know that when we first went out to Seacher Bay, I was quite young at the time. This was 18 years ago, a young father. Kind of had this misconception in my mind that you just go out to the land and somehow the land's going to heal you, or it's going to, have that sort of quality. And sure enough, there is an element to it like that. But what really kind of caught me by surprise that I wasn't really thinking about or prepared for, but it was not unexpected afterwards, was that the land was just as damaged and just as traumatized as we are. And when we look up at the mountain behind us, it was clear cut, and there were stumps sticking out. And it wasn't the only one. It was mountain Nuu-chah after Nuu-chah, just bald, right? All of the areas where our salmon would go to migrate, just destroyed, just littered with the leftovers, the remains that they couldn't take with them. Landslides that had just eroded, these beautiful mountains, destroying habitats and homes of how many, countless other life forms that are out there. And so there was that element. We went out and we were feeling damaged. We were feeling traumatized. We were feeling a need to get replenished from the land and from the ocean. And when we went out, what we discovered at first was that the land was going through the same thing. It was experiencing the same trauma. And so over time, what we did was we started to repair that relationship. We'd go and we'd do the best, not go to fix areas, but what we found was most effective was we'd go to a forest and just sit and listen. Again, another teaching that Uncle Simon would always share, Aasʔałuk ish mamati, Aasʔałuk ish hypocrisy, na'atahai. So sometimes the birds have something to say, and sometimes the forest has something to say. And all you have to do is listen. And in this world that we live in, we often just don't do that. I don't mean us in this room, I mean more us generally as a people, and especially our younger people. So many distractions around our young people. So many things taking them away and occupying their minds and filling their minds with who knows what. And we don't know what that effect is going to have until they become adults, until they become grandparents. And so that's the scary part with that element of it. But drawing back from the teaching from Uncle Simon of just going out and listening, that we don't always have the answers immediately. And when you hear the stories, the Ahousaht of our people, all of those old stories that have so much valuable teachings to share. Whenever there was some sort of catastrophe that occurs in these stories, one of the common things that the characters in these stories will do right away, they'll usanch. They'll go and they'll pray to the ancestors and call them and invite them and ask them, what should I do? And then they'll humble themselves and listen. And that's what they wait for, some sort of sign. And listening isn't always just with the puppy. Listening can be with your shlimaksti, or it could be just being present in those spaces too. And so, Aasʔałuk ish mamati, Aasʔałuk ish hypocrisy. Sometimes they have something to say if we just listen. So that became a practice in our family too. We'd just go out and instead of trying to repair, thinking, well, humans caused this problem, which is sort of the environmental approach to things. Humans caused this problem, we're going to be the saviors and fix it. Well, that mentality can be destructive too. And we can feel that as Koas people. Again, it's so relatable for us as Koas. We're like the trees, we're like the animals, we're like the birds, we're like the water. We're that type of interconnectedness. When we think of aasʔałuk, then to me it means that we are all on one level playing field as living beings in this environment. And that we all look out for one another when we can. And so, going out and fixing is a different mentality. But going out and listening is one that has brought a lot of really valuable lessons for us. And so what we did when we would do that is we'd go into areas where the forest was completely damaged, and we would just sit and harvest what little we could or not if it just seemed like it was going to take away too much. And then what we started to appreciate is that the forest and the animals, that they are healing, that they have their own natural mechanisms for healing. That if we just take a step back, instead of trying to manage and oversee all of those pieces that are beyond our control, then what we see is that the forest starts to come back. And it starts at the floor level. It starts with the moss. Moss, right? So an intact forest, you'll see that it's covered with moss. It's covered with sword ferns, shikmot. It's covered with all of these different things, all at the ground level first, that are nurturing the soil and nurturing, incubating all these pieces and creating the opportunity for life to flourish again. And sometimes what we do when we see these devastated environments, we see the stumps or we see the fallen trees or we see the absence of the trees that used to be there, and it hurts us, it hurts our hearts, and that's what we see and we take away. But we might not be looking at what's beneath our feet. The mushrooms that are growing and all the other things that are so integral and interconnected with each other. Even the chimps and how they come and they'll drop fish remains by the trees, knowing that it's contributing back into that ecosystem. That's their contribution. What is our contribution other than taking? Is sort of a question that starts to emerge. And how can we learn in that natural way by just listening to our environment? So a sense of hopefulness overtakes us, because it can feel discouraging when it feels like everything is lost. And I felt that in my life, like I was sharing earlier, without having my grandparents directly there. My uncles had a lot of challenges in their life, and were often busy too. My late Uncle Ray was a very busy man, and was a very generous and caring man, and shared himself with many, many people in that regard. But the teachings internally within the family weren't always fully there. And that made me feel as though it was gone. And that sense of hopelessness was easy to seep in. But going out to the forest and being in the same environments where our ancestors thrived in ancestral times, suddenly it turned something, and the hopefulness came back and replaced that hopelessness. And that suddenly we could appreciate that if we repair these relationships with the land in our own way, not trying to fix it right away or do those things, but just our relationship, our communication with the land, listening and just being present, then that is the materials and the ingredients that provided the insights and the knowledge and the intelligence of our ancestors. That was the world of which they come from. And that was the way that we learned. And we learn from one another, and we share with one another in that process too. So repairing our relationships with the land is a really important piece, I feel, and our family takes on for ourselves, because it opens up so many other opportunities, and it leads towards a stronger ability to be able to take on your own health, your own well-being, and to overcome some of the trauma and the challenges that we've inherited or that we've experienced within our life. And those things aren't easy by any means. And we are all navigating through those traumas in different ways. And so that's a lesson learned, is that just going out into the forest, or going on the beach, or going out onto the ocean, and just allowing ourselves to listen to what it is saying can sometimes bring us that lesson that we might be looking for. And so repairing the relationship with the land is one piece. And then repairing the relationship with our foods. You know, when we go through a grocery store and we're pushing a shopping cart, there is very little relationship with that food that's on the shelves, unless you're shopping at a very unique type of a store. And so we fill up our shopping carts, and we end up filling up our bodies with these things that are artificial, that are synthesized, that are processed, that are filled with things that our body just doesn't even need or can't even handle. And so that relationship with our food has drastically altered too. And so, you know, in past times, we have this concept of aasʔałuk. Aasʔałuk means like traveling and gathering and eating while you're going, knowing that there's going to be food around from here to there, and that you just have to know where a berry patch is, or where there's going to be some food sources or some clams or whatever it is that you're going to be able to eat along your journey. That was how self-sufficient that we were, and that we wouldn't even have to pack a lot of food with us, knowing that we could just aasʔałuk. We could pick and gather and eat the food as we were going along. Another concept from our ancestors would be aasʔałuk. Aasʔałuk is when you invite yourself over for a meal, which nowadays could seem kind of rude, maybe compared to this society that we live in, when you just show up and you're hungry. But in traditional times, that was an act of respect. It meant that you knew that this family was going to open up their house, and that they were going to share a meal with you, and that you were going to have good company. And in exchange, they may come to your house one day and invite themselves over. Aasʔałuk also, right? And so these concepts of how we shared food with one another and how we related to our food have also changed drastically, not only the relationship with the land. And so this all starts boiling down. So it's the land, it's our community and our families, and then it's ourselves. The relationship that we have with ourselves has changed too. You know, nowadays, we've been fed so much misinformation, I feel it is, you know, or negative information. We're reinforced with a lot of negative information as coerced people. We're told we have the highest rate of this and this and this, and the successes or the strengths that we have are often overlooked. But yet, all the statistics around the rates of diabetes or heart disease or cancer, or you look at other factions of society, the rates of our children who are unsuccessfully graduating, or the rates of abuse that's happening in the community, or other things. You know, there are all these negative statistics that are all constantly there available to us to remind us of just how weak or inferior we are, it seems. And we have to question that. We have to determine for ourselves, is that true? You know, and yes, we are impacted, but is it because of our ethnicity? Is it because of being Khoas, like we're often told that we're predisposed or genetically predisposed to certain diseases because of the ancestry that we have? Or is it more related to this way of life that was forced upon us and the way of life that we were forcibly removed from, which I think is more the truth side of things, which a lot of Mamahli people and organizations and governments really don't want to venture too far into conversation-wise. And so that strength that comes from our ancestry, from our teachings, from our food, from our medicine, from our language, from our way of life, from the way that we interact with each other, just by opening our door and welcoming a loved one in and feeding them the best foods that we have available, making sure that they're fed, that they have something to drink, that they're taken care of. These are the concepts, these are the practices and the teachings that have carried us through so many huge challenges in the past. And there's a reason why we still do that naturally. There's a reason, like these are teachings often that we don't even have to verbally say to one another. We do it naturally. And that's the important part, that there's, in our Shimoksti, there's a way of knowing. There's a way of knowing that we sometimes suppress when we try to engage only in the way of knowing that Mamahli people do. So coming into a space like this, it excites me, because this is our way of knowing and doing and being. It's coming together and sharing our stories and our experiences, sharing the knowledge that we have, uplifting each other in the practices that we can share with each other, and sharing meals with each other, sharing food with each other, sharing laughter. These are the medicines and the gifts that we have as a people. And so when we're looking forward and bringing back to more directly this issue that we're here to really focus on, to hyper-focus on with diabetes, it's preventable in almost all parts. It's something that we can avoid if we can elevate our way of thinking and being around these things. And quite often, and I know in my own life and with my own health, it's usually only too late when we start to really kind of understand those pieces. And so the hopes are that for our children and the next following generations, that it doesn't have to be too late for them to have that understanding. That they can be raised and groomed and nurtured in a way where they're going to be more predisposed to be healthy, where they're genetically predisposed to be strong, where they're going to live long lives and have a long life expectancy. Aasʔałuk, we call that. When you live well over the age of 100, which used to be common. We want to see that become common again. And how do we do that? Well, we share our stories. We share our experiences, whether they're hard stories and challenging stories of perseverance and resilience and hardship, or if there's stories of success, like going out onto the land and some of the other things that we have as families to share. We need to hear all of those stories. We need to be able to let out those stories, those of us that are holding them. We need to be able to hear them, the young ones, and see and have that transparency and that honesty and that approach to life so that they're not confused by things that they encounter later on in their life as adults, that they understand it and that they're prepared for it. So I thank you all for being here, for providing this opportunity to share. This is a passion of ours. This is something that we know has to be a lifestyle. And so we're currently living in Motsquoi right now temporarily to dismantle some of the structures that are there. We're provided an opportunity to salvage and repurpose some building materials because our intention is to stay out on the land. We don't, maybe back in Seacher Bay, we're not too sure, but we want to remain out there. And that's where we're setting our roots and we're going to dig in and be out.